To set the stage and to give us a overall general direction, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harkins to start us off.
Thank you very much. And what I want to do is thank you all for your time and thank you for being interested in this topic, because we know that high behavioral expectations are what we need to have for our students, and helping them to achieve it is part of the teaching that we do every day. And that goes along with high academic expectations, so that it is foundational to that. So I want to set the stage that this is really a larger conversation than a code of conduct. And I refer to this pyramid as 80% of what we do is preventative and proactive, trying to make sure that students are taught how to behave appropriately in our schools. That's what happens in great classrooms, that's what happens in great schools, that's what happens in a great district. And what we want to do is be the best district at doing that, is making sure that we're doing everything we can so that students do behave appropriately. And then the second part of that is that line that says, but it needs to be crystal clear. And Dr. Marshall's going to go over what the U.S. Department of Education says. It needs to be crystal clear what appropriate behavior is and what those expectations are and what the consequences are. And those need to be applied fairly and equitably. And so making it really clear to students is a way to help them behave appropriately. So that's very, very important. And then we know that even when a student makes an inappropriate choice, that it's our responsibility to restore, to reteach, to help the student learn from that choice. That's what we do. And we know we're successful when the student doesn't make the choice again. So monitoring data in this system is really, really important. So I want to point also to putting it in a larger conversation is Vision 2020. Vision 2020 has ambitious goals. This is part of it, or the bigger conversation is improve culture and climate. And I'm going to say to you, and I'm going to challenge this committee, is use research-based evidence or data or best practice to defend anything that we do. And we want to be the best district in the world at this, but what districts are already good at that? I think that's a to-do. This committee uncovered Baltimore City as potentially being a district that is doing some good work, but what other districts nationally can we learn from that are moving on this continuum, again, of doing everything we can to help students understand what appropriate is. So that's where we want to spend our time, our energy, and frankly our dollars on the preventative part of it to create really healthy cultures and climate. Somebody asked, why do we do this? Well, it's in statute, statute 158.148, that each local board of education shall be responsible for formulating a code of acceptable behavior and discipline to apply to the students in each school. And the code shall be updated no less frequently than every 2 years. So when we called our document Code of Acceptable Behavior and Discipline, we took it right from statute. Now there's been conversation and the committee has worked about maybe it needs to be more positive, maybe it needs to be set the tone for broader. So I think that's where we got it, but that doesn't mean that's what it needs to be called. And of course we have a board policy. And I've heard clearly from the board, and I want to acknowledge Board Member Horn and Board Member Willner that are here. Thank you so much for spending your time here with us, is to say that the expectation of the board is that they set the guideline to be, and set the standard that we do all of those proactive things well and research-based. That it isn't just being the best in the world at setting the expectations and then giving consequences to students, it's being the best in the world at that. So as I look at the policy, I think we have some work to do and look at districts that we want to be like to set a policy that says, really, our time needs to be spent in all of the proactive things and positive approaches, again, to teach the wonderful students that we have what appropriate is in JCPS. So I'm going to also challenge you to say, again, research, data. This policy says I have to recommend to the board any proposed changes, I can't go to the board without a basis that is clearly an argument that makes the world better for JCPS and our students. So that's really what we need to do. So I'm going to really push you to think really critically about why we would be doing anything that we're doing. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Wright, who's one of the facilitators.
Thank you, Dr. Hargens. First of all, I want to begin just to reiterate the thank you. We do appreciate you being here and taking time out of your very busy schedules, but as Dr. Hargens mentioned, our purpose is to reconvene the committee today and continue to have those true, candid conversations that we've had over the past couple of weeks, and also review in terms of what we've done thus far, but more importantly, the why behind it. And just to remind yourselves that Mindy, Kristen, and I are the facilitators, which we will be assisting in terms of making sure that we stay on track. But more importantly, we want to encourage the type of honest conversation that you've had. You've had such great conversations among you. So as we pose some of the questions, as we go back to review the data that was presented to you on day one, and as we go back to look at those changes, we want to once again encourage you to determine the why behind those decisions that were made. And once again, want to thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started because we know that your time is very valuable. So on that note, Dr. John Marshall will review the data. Thank you.
Good morning. Again, thank you for being here. We will go through the data that was submitted by our data research team that was presented at the first 2 or 3 code of conduct meetings. And so an overview for your consideration as you move through the JCPS code of conduct, you were asked to stay faithful to the strategic plan, guiding principles, and the impacts of last JCPS's code of conduct. Best practices and discipline policy informed by the research, JCPS data and analysis, and JCPS data tools. Does everyone remember doing this and being a part of this before I move on? And excuse my voice, I'm sick. How can our code of conduct reflect our strategic plan? Dr. Hargens talked about the strategic plan. There is an expectation to stay faithful to that and be equitable and use data to make sure that our strategic plan moves forward so we can become the best urban school district. We understand what our core values are. They are also in the strategic plan. And strategies and implementations and indicators. So those are some of the things we will review as we go through this. We have Dr. Florence Chain here as well, so if there's some questions that comes up, if I cannot answer them, we will lean to her to answer some of them as well. Florence, can you, Florence? There she is right there. Okay, what do we value? And we talked about this is strategic plan 2020. Caring, equity, excellence, respect, individuality, diversity, opportunity, creativity, collaboration, and stewardship. Excellence with equity. What is our vision? All JCPS students graduate prepared, empowered, and inspired to reach their full potential and contribute as thoughtful, responsible citizens of our diverse, shared world. How can our policies and practices promote this, the strategic plan? Strategy 2.13, improve a culture and climate. Use research-based practices and best practices to improve district, school, classroom culture, and climate to ensure that all students and staff work and learn in a safe, respectable, and equitable environment. Centrality of the school code or the school climate in the code of conduct discipline discussion. U.S. Department of Education, JCPS is not pulling this out of a hat. There are some guiding principles to move this forward. U.S. Department of Education Principle 1. I'll repeat, U.S. Department of Education Principle 1. Schools that foster positive school climates can help to engage all students in learning by preventing problem behaviors and intervening effectively to support struggling and at-risk students. In JCPS, student sense of belonging was the strongest predictor of suspensions. Student sense of belonging is the strongest predictor of suspensions. That's Vandehar and PBIS analysis 2015. And strongest, most consistent predictor of achievement See Wigger CSS Analysis 2015. Sense of belonging is nurtured by a positive and caring school climate, National School Climate Center. All of this was presented to you before, and this is the research, so I don't know if we need to discuss and get into, are we using research? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. How can we communicate our priorities through messaging? So here are some of the things that we use to communicate our priorities. You have the code of conduct. We were looking at some of the Cincinnati public school work, and these are some things. These are some of the things that Dr. Van der Haar has put up and used as examples of things that are driving the work. What impact are the last code of conduct policy changes have so far based on data? One of the key changes is eliminating the 4 to 5 day suspension. Reduction in the number of days students are suspended and losing instructional time. So if you recall, last year that was taken off of the code of conduct. Elimination of the 4 to 5 day suspension. We went from 226 to 115 number and percent of a 4 to 5 day suspension. This was through day 96. So you do see, you do see a decrease. Change language, will suspend to may suspend. We understand what that means. We gave some autonomy to the assistant principals so they can go from will to may, and they get to choose inside the school what that means. The assistant principals and the principals get to choose. Is there anyone that's not clear on will and may? Okay. Key change, inclusion of language for alternative in-school options, restorative and positive proactive approaches. Goal, encourage use of positive and restorative measures as a first resort for incidents that mandate suspensions. Anyone in the committee not clear or understanding what that is? Okay. Slight reduction in suspension for fighting. Slight reduction in suspension for fighting went from 62 to 58. From 2014 to 2015. Nothing to celebrate, but there is a decline, and as you can see in the numbers. Best policy practices, clearly defining behaviors. Again, U.S. Department of Education, best policy practices for clearly defining behaviors. Create positive climate. Develop clear, appropriate, consistent expectations and consequences. And if I have time, the Chief Equity Officer is going to go back to clear and consistent. Ensure fairness, equity, and continuous improvement. Ensure fairness, equity, and continuous improvement. Is there anyone that has any questions about, in the committee, have any questions about this part? Okay, because this can stay a presentation or it can be a dialogue, but what we need to make sure is, Dr. Harvey said, jump in and discuss, because there can't be any, this is what you're here for. U.S. Department of Education, expectations and consequences. Schools that have discipline policies or codes of conduct with clear, appropriate, and consistently applied expectations and consequences will help students improve behavior, increase engagement, and boost achievement. Core challenge, top categories not clearly defined. Let's look at these top categories. Disruptive behavior and failure to obey. Core challenges, disruptive behavior and failure to obey. Those were the core challenges that the data presented, our district presented, and it lines up with the national data. How can this be problematic? Research literature tells us allows too much discretion, results in inconsistency, between schools, and can result in inconsistent and unfair application of discipline. Is there anyone that in the committee that challenges this, doesn't understand, doesn't agree? So, let's talk about variability of judgment. The variability of judgment that is happening inside of our schools, because of those two, failure to obey, you have a range of things that are resulting in suspension. From student was disrespectful to students were involved in argument resulting in tables being pushed down, chairs being kicked out and thrown. If we are really charged as a committee, and if we are really serious about fair treatment, if we go back to these things, the thing that we must address is this. The variability of judgment for our students ranges in one category from student was disrespectful to rude in class to this. Anybody doesn't understand that? Okay. Best practice policy examples. So, we use Baltimore, and help me out, facilitators. Baltimore kind of rose to the top as a, we're going to pass those down. I'm so sorry, you all. Baltimore kind of rose to the top as a district that is making strides in addressing the deliberate disruption, and I believe they tiered it. Is that correct? Is that correct, Mindy and Suzanne?
Yes.
So I'll wait as they pass these out.
So just to ground you once again, this was the document that was shared with you all during the meetings that we had. And there were changes, if you can see, aligned to the PBIS language that we have within our district. So once again, this was grounded in research, so therefore then you had an opportunity to do some work within it as well. Questions or comments? Yes, Dan?
Okay, Baltimore is grounded in research. I'm sorry, I don't recall seeing data about the before and after. Before Baltimore went through this, they had X number of fights, assaults, and so forth. After they went through this, they have drastically less. Do we have that kind of research? I mean, if we're going to use Baltimore as a best practice, then, I'm kind of curious, was it successful?
That's a good question. Marshall, I know that in terms of the success, it was regarding breaking down the example for the levels, but can you speak to that in regards to the changes with Baltimore?
I mean, I guess where I'm coming from is what we're doing now doesn't work. If we change, we need to go to something that does work, and the evidence shows it works.
So when you follow urban school district and urban school data, you're not going to see change, which is actually makes sense, 1, 2, or 3 years. To change big urban school districts with changes like this, you might not see an impact for like 4 or 5 years. So to ask, is Baltimore working? Excuse me, Dr. Chang?
What I will say about Baltimore, when they talk about the code of conduct and the changes they made, they've also given some guidance about
what made it effective was not just the changes, it was weekly implementation and check on the data after they implemented this. So they talk about how they would look at data related to suspensions for, say, truancy. And so that didn't align with their new code of conduct, so they would actually look at that data on a very high frequent basis right after it was launched to make sure it was being monitored. So that was the key really to the change. It was both the code and the follow-up. That makes sense.
And I can't remember, and Dr. Dawson Evers brought this up, a lot of the districts that moved to change were putting millions of dollars behind changing culture and climate into the school district as well.
So to continue, yeah, so once again, we talk about the good news of doing this, because then what this allows us to do with an infinite campus is to capture that first bullet, which is the proactive and the restorative practices that we are going to, that we are already currently working on actually, but then it provides us with an opportunity to continue that work and then to celebrate. And then more importantly, which I think is key, which is what Dr. Hargens mentioned earlier, was the piece about monitoring. So monitoring exactly what we're doing in the classroom and being able to track our progress. Because obviously it's best quality to monitor, and going back to what Dr. Marshall was talking about when it comes to fairness and equity. The U.S. Department of Ed slide once again, really reinforcing and reiterating the need for the positive climate. Like Marshall mentioned, this is not something that we're just kind of like, okay, this is what we're going to do, but we have guiding principles by the U.S. Department of Education. Principle 3 focuses on the equity and the continuous improvement, which is why we are here to continue the conversation. And as he mentioned, it's the dialogue that we need to have now to determine, in terms of the direction we want to go. Some additional information that was presented focuses on that piece about absenteeism. So if we are proactive in our approach, the students then feel that sense of belonging, and therefore absenteeism and dropout rates are lower. Fairness of school discipline and overall well-disciplined schools as established by the research that is shown right there. So in JCPS, when they did the analysis, they found the statistically significant relations between, and we all know this, and this is what Dr. Hargens was mentioning earlier. When students are clear about their expectations in terms of what is expected of them, this is the result. High correlation. It's understanding those behavioral expectations. The relationship between the consistency of the punishments that are applied, which is a discussion regarding that deliberate disruptions, which is why that was a core challenge. Because we have to ask ourselves, when it comes to those disruptions, are we in fact being consistent? So this was some of the data pulled 2015 between middle and high school students. When it comes down to it, the question asked, do students at this school understand expectations for their behavior? 61.6, agreed, 38.4. And then when you go down further in terms of the punishment. So having this amount of students not understanding their expectations and the inconsistency regarding the punishment is something to think about as we move forward. So monitoring and implementation of the code. So this is kind of, and this came up a lot during the discussions in the committee meetings that we had. Once we have this, what's next? So kind of reviewing back once again to that first presentation. So we're looking at the format behavior before and now. So what this is was a tool, because that was one of the things. How do you effectively monitor the changes, and how do you effectively monitor what we're doing in regards to as a whole, as a district? So this right here is our dashboard, going back to that first day, and how it is a shift of culture and empowering schools in general. So kind of give you a couple minutes to look at that. And then one thing is a change regarding the dashboard as far as it being interactive in nature. So in other words, we have the tools within JCPS, but then again, it's strengthening, but more importantly, how do we use this data for continuous improvement and sustained student success? So when it came down to looking at the core challenge, Dr. Doss had spent some time looking at the disruptive behavior and the failure to obey, as our core challenges mentioned earlier. So when you look at the numbers of the students and how much it affects disruptive behavior and failure to obey staff, those are the top 12. So when we look at top referrals, those are the top 2, which was reason as to why we took the failure to obey staff and outlined it more specifically. And that just gives you. Have enough time, sir? Okay. So once again, just additional data. So this right here allows you then to disaggregate the data a little bit more when it comes down to the numbers. So that way you're intentional, breaking it all the way down to race and gender. So when we talked about, once again, that core challenge, just to refresh our memory, which is why the discussed changes were significant, is because when it comes down to it, 83%, and I think this was alarming to many of the committee members, that when it comes down to it, minor, 83% of those referrals were minor behaviors. I'm going to leave this here for just a second so that way we can internalize this slide. 83% minor, 16% aggression, and when it came down to law violations, 1%. So that breaks it down into the categories. Category 1 with the minor, the top 2 once again show up, are core challenges. Disruptive behavior and failure to obey staff. But this slide basically breaks down those 3 categories. You want to?
Yes, please.
Is there any way we could get a printout of this?
It's online.
This is the first presentation that they presented in January 29th.
It's online. If you go to JCPS,
Okay.
you go to the website and then go to About Us, Leadership and Organization, then there's a committees page. At the bottom of the committees, there's links to this presentation.
And it was presented that first day. Thank you, Tony, for that. So these are the categories that do break it down. So it's accessible because it is open and on the web. So when it comes down to the resolution, what was logged in terms of data and numbers, so 28% of the resolutions for those referrals that we just showed were restorative. Now remember, about 80% of them were minor, but 28% of them were restorative approaches, 22 inclusive, and 49% were exclusion. So when we're talking 80% minor, 49% of those responses were exclusion, meaning they were missing instructional time. Glenn.
I think the only thing about this one that contextually we need to think about as well is that those are events that are actually placed into Infinite Campus. This doesn't reflect, I'm sure, because I know the schools probably wouldn't have the time, nor teachers would have the time to enter the proactive, the things that the in-class measures and those types of things. So this data, I suspect, is only to the level where it actually gets entered in. So even though we see exclusion of 49%, they're going to be on the other end of this. There are going to be multiple instances of staff members doing school classroom level and school level things that aren't here. So though like you, this is disturbing, but it doesn't tell the whole picture with regard to this paints a picture that we're just automatically excluding students, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate.
Thank you, Dr. Beatty. So this goes into kind of detailing the actual responses that were done. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm just curious about that point. If 83% of the behaviors are minor, even if you double that number for restorative practices, it still doesn't equal 83% of the interventions. So I think there's still disproportionate response. And I think that just feeds back into what's subjective, what's difficult to define, is difficult to apply equitably. So even if you double the number, even if you give 50% to a restorative model, response is still 30% difference in what the actual behavior is.
Those things happen in classrooms every day.
Yes, and just to, because this is a review, and just to review the day one discussions that we had, was being able to operationalize the term deliberate disruptions because of the subjectivity. So definitely something. And once again, as Dr. Marshall said, dialogue. We want to have this dialogue to be able to have these discussions in order to move forward and discuss some of these issues that are in fact that you were expressing right now. And then I'm going to move on. So that was day one. That was by Nina Dossett. So the second presentation in terms of reviewing the data was one that Dr. Judy Vanderhart did, which was exploring and really looking at those core challenges.
And before we move on, then, was there any reflection or comments on that presentation as a whole? Anything new to the committee? Don't remember, don't recall? Okay. So we did the review from last meeting. We started looking at disruptive behavior, and then based on some committee feedback, the facilitators, if I'm correct, came back and started thinking and talking about considerations and intensity levels. Is that correct? Top reasons for JCPS referrals every year and in every grade level: disruptive behavior and failure to obey. Everybody remembers that? Is there any comments or questions about this particular part of it? Okay. Why is this problematic? Research literature tells us. Allows too much discretion and results in inconsistent behaviors, can result in inconsistent and unfair application. Disruptive behavior and deliberate disruption. If we put a pin here, there was a lot of discussion around this. And if you remember, there was even admission that it was hard to identify and define what disruptive behavior is. The committee as a whole was struggling with where to put things, how do we define it, etc. Is that correct? Am I doing you all justice? Okay. All right, so behaviors resulting in referrals, again, 83%, 16% to 1%. Minor, 83%. So, this is Dr. Vanderhaar's. Dr. Vanderhaar broke this down more, with 30.4 of the suspensions being disruptive behavior, and 20.1 being failure to obey, and 23 being for attendance issues, tardy and skipping. That's what that 83, if I'm looking at this right, it compiled. Did we remember that? Don, you good? Okay. So referrals by race. I don't think there's any shock here. This is the referrals by race. So as we go back into the subjectivity, as some of our committee members said, this is how we ended up, this is the data broken down from our data shop. What percentage of students get repeat disruptive behavior? I don't know if you all can see this. One referral, 49%, more than one referral, 51%. And 15% or more than 5%. Avoid simplification of issues. I'll let you all read that. I'll slow down a bit. So the English teacher in me would always have something like this and ask someone to summarize or paraphrase what this means. Rashad, after you read that, or anyone, can someone, or Cherie, can someone say what this means?
Absolutely. From my reading, and I think it gets at the core of what some of the challenges are, is that these are extremely complex issues, right? And when we're talking about the complexity of a student or an individual who lives in a milieu where they may be experiencing poverty, witnessing domestic violence, where they might be exposed to challenging realities, when they come to school carrying some of that, the way we react to those students is tremendous, and the way that we support and nurture those students in such a way that they can be platformed to learn appropriately is tremendous, and has a direct impact on the safety of our schools and the safety of our neighborhoods. So when we utilize exclusionary practices in a heavy-handed manner, in many ways that continues to increase some of the danger that we experience in our schools or in our neighborhoods. So for me, and particularly as we talked about some of the behaviors, like if a student is sleeping in class, is that deliberately disruptive? But I think we have to really think about some of the context. Did that student have a proper meal that morning? Did that student witness an incident in the home the previous evening? Is that student experiencing trauma as part of their ability to sleep or not sleep, a symptom of some of the trauma that they're experiencing? And how are we really kind of bringing some of those students in and really resourcing students and families in such a way that school is not a place where they don't feel attached, don't feel some of that affiliation?
Anyone else wish to comment, disagree, don't like, as far as the committee, this comment? All right. Intensity levels for disruptive behavior is kind of the same slide. we go from very general or very mild student wrote an obscene note with profanity to student stabbed another student with a pencil, all qualified under disruptive behavior. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think school 1's elementary, school 2 is high school. I cannot remember, Florence, and you weren't here, so you do not know. This is all elementary.
This right here, yeah, there's 3 slides, so this one, same element.
Oh, okay. So we got middle school. Does this beg for questions or comments from the committee? I mean, you all have seen this.
I just want to point out again from the elementary school slide that when we talk about consistency, if you look at the 14-15 code that was revised, you can't suspend elementary school kids for profanity. And I think part of the conversation with Judy was that since you can't do it through the profanity code, then people were doing it under disruptive behavior. So part of the conversation was the discretion to move things that you can't suspend for according to the code under that catch-all. And that's why we were looking at, that's one of the reasons we were looking at the deliberate disruption.
Any facilitators want to comment on that? Yes. Now, and hold on, before we even start this, I want to make sure, is this open for community conversation, Dr. Harkins, or are we doing that at the summit?
I mean, I think that people can ask their questions is important.
Can we parking lot the questions and have them answered at the summit? And I have no issue answering any of these questions, but I want to make sure we set a precedent, because Ms. Doss has a question.
That wasn't a question, it's whether or not it was appropriate to ask questions.
Oh, right. And I'm good either way.
I'm feeling a little excluded in a way that, it's great to have the public input, but when do we get a chance to check?
Well, I thought that's what the summit was for.
I mean, if we can accommodate it within the time frame. And John, I will just say that isn't one of the issues is that when it says the student stabbed another student with a pencil, it isn't that is overlooked, but that is categorized as what it appropriately should be categorized and dealt with. So it was put, is your point, John, it was put inappropriately in deliberate disruption?
Deliberate disruption and the committee can answer that, because the committee is the one that has kind of talked about this. As we talk about stabbing with pencils to cussing out, what did we come up with as we got principals in here? What does that, can that qualify as another infraction that's already on the code of conduct?
Okay, student bit another student, that's assault. That's covered elsewhere in the code. Student stabbed another student, that's also assault, and that's covered in the code. I don't know why they have it in disruptive behavior. Some of this seems to be covered elsewhere in the code.
And one of the first, and I think a lot of you might remember, one of the very first activities we did on that day was I just said brainstorm, name any single behavior that you would probably think about that would be categorized under deliberate disruption. And as a result, Stan, you're exactly right, because some of the things that people, not necessarily ones that they witnessed, but just heard perhaps other teachers talk about, did fall under other categories that were already outlined within the code. So that's a very good point.
This actual slide was actually meant to show what was growing structure.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
This slide that you're showing now, the slide that you're showing now was actually meant to show what we could throw into a deliberate disruption category, and the reason why we're looking at breaking it down into more separate categories so it can be more decisive. And
So there was a question from.
So the same administrator wrote suspensions for school number 1 for the lower and the higher intensity, right? That was an AP or possibly principal decision.
And that, I'm not sure if it was the same school or just sample referrals. Same school.
Same school, but I'm just
Same.
School 1, school 2. Right, so from lower intensity, higher intensity school, when we assume that since it's an elementary school, the same person decided to do the suspension, right? Do we know if the lower intensity one, if that's a student who had common disruptive behaviors over and over and over every day?
No, not from the slide that this was put together, we do not.
But the administrator would know that.
Yes.
So the administrator would have, you know, a professional opinion on, you know, how disruptive this same student was.
Correct. Yes, the AP, counselor, principal. I saw someone's, yes.
What roles do the SBM committees have in addition to the dashboard, like the ECE population is?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, you gotta go. The SBM committees, how do they play a role in the code of conduct? And then on the dashboard, if it look as well, like the ECE students were more representative, perhaps?
The code of conduct is the code of conduct for every school. So the SBDM's rules in that, I'm not, and maybe Dr. Hart can speak more to it, the SBDM's rules are governance in that, I'm not sure where they stop and where they start. But as far as the ECE question discussed, I'm not sure which one, which slide you were referring to. Oh, this is as far as this one's at. Oh, okay.
It might have been the other.
It's probably the other slide.
But what's the
I mean, the
question?
other slide that.
We'll take a note of that.
Did I do the SBDM question justice?
John.
SBDM can do more, but no less. So the code of conduct is what they must adhere to. SBDM at the school level would be taking it further if that's what the school decides. But all bases start with the code of conduct.
There was a.
But it cannot override these means.
Correct. Right.
Let's go to.
Yes.
That question. Okay, so that I can understand, just for my clarity. Okay, so like, okay, we took deliberate disruption and tried to divide it up into categories. Is there, I mean, I don't understand what's the big deal with doing that. I mean, when you look at data, wouldn't you want to try to break down the data? Because you do have administrators out there putting everything on the deliberate disruption. That's a common practice. When it don't fit, we'll find something to make it fit. So my thing is that I mean, is there, I just want to have another argument as far as, is that the problem? Everybody, why is people mad?
So there's a lot of research that says deliberate disruption is subjective bias and perpetuates racism. So the discussion that was brought forth that the committee was to look at was to figure out if deliberate disruption was in fact a catch-all. And Florence, help me if I'm doing justice to this. If deliberate disruption was in fact a catch-all, and we see from our data that it is.
Right.
So we went, so if I'm correct with the facilitators, the committee decided to go to tiering to look to see if we could kind of capture that in a more accurate way. So you're asking me why are people mad? Again, as the chief equity officer, I said it needs to come off. So, but we'll move forward in a minute here.
And we talked about this in the work session with the board, is that if a behavior happens and you ask 50 students, do you understand what the expectation for behavior is? You should get a similar answer. And if you give the same behavior to 50 administrators, you should get, well, that fits with here. That's the consequence for that inappropriate behavior. So that's what we're working toward, this real clarity about what it is. So I think as I look at this is, whatever the laundry basket is of deliberate disruption, it appears to me that right now in our current system, there are some very serious things in that category that everybody in this room agrees does not meet the bar for behavioral expectations in Jefferson County Public Schools. So I think what people want clarity around is that that is going to be dealt with, that it's going to be categorized appropriately and dealt with. And it's not just going to be a laundry basket. So I think the challenge of if you keep everything in a laundry basket and then you put 3 laundry baskets and you throw everything that was in that original laundry basket into 3 different laundry baskets, you've still kept the same behaviors that inappropriately or appropriately should have been in that laundry basket, in the laundry basket. So I think what everybody's saying is this idea of what should it really be so that it's clear to students that doing some, or stabbing another student with a pencil is not acceptable. And that is going to be dealt with as what it is. And other things are going to be dealt with as well. So I think that's the fear is if you, I think, do away with it, that all the behaviors that were in that laundry basket are no longer important or no longer significant. So I think that is what this group's got to bring clarity around, is how do you deal with the behaviors that you need to deal with, and how do you not put everything in there? And from one school to the other, everybody's laundry basket looks different in that category. So if I'm a student who's moved to 5 different schools, there are 5 different sets of the way this works, right? And it's very hard for me to know as a student where the line is for behavior if it's different everywhere. So that's, I think, the clarity that we're trying to get, and that this group is working toward. And I appreciate the conversations and the efforts, because that's what we're all trying to get. So I'll turn it.
There was a question back in the corner, not Mr. Hugo. I'm coming by.
Well, I got to comment from watching this. Again, my name is Paul, my rep that. Watching this, we are having discussions or trying to explain this procedure. If we're not understanding this, that just proves that the children don't understand this problem. So that's process. And there's another point I think I might need to get other inputs from people outside of this committee. That's the problem with this committee, but get some other points of views to be appreciated. Personally, I don't think it's fair for a child in the West End to get punished more harshly than it is in the East End. They're both the same children. Why should one get punished more than the other? I mean, I understand. I mean, it'd be easier to cut all the way around across the district. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. They need to have, there needs to be a strict line saying this is the consequences when this happens. Right now, depending on what school, I'm not only a representative, I'm a parent. My son is in high school, okay? So I've got to add a stake to this. I want my son to know that when he goes to school, he's safe. They have locked down high schools that news medias don't know about. There'll be 4, 5, 6 fights in school, and they'll lock it down. That happens on a daily basis. We're looking at a report that up there says that the amount of suspensions went down. Okay, yes, but how many fights were increased? The numbers showing suspensions went down, but where is it showing that these assaults and fights have actually gone up or gone down? That's the data I'd like to see.
I just have a question. So I understand in this part of it, the committee kind of started tiering stuff, disruptive behavior. And some of these disruptive behaviors probably should not be suspensions, and maybe there's a lot of confusion out there. And so let's figure out a way to help principals understand better which ones are suspendable disruptive behavior and which ones are not. But then I think there's a piece of was confusing to me in the first PowerPoint. There was will be, maybe. So it looks like if I was a principal or vice principal, that creates some confusion for me. So now when I look at this, okay, I can suspend, or maybe I don't have to suspend. So are we, I mean, it feels like, you know, we're tiering this, but then we're saying, you know, you can suspend or you don't have to suspend. So for the administrator, I'm confused, and then for the student, well, I did that last 2 months ago, and I got this consequence, and now I'm doing it now, and now they're telling me they're going to suspend me for it. Well, but there is a will or may. So the administrator can go whichever way they want to go with. It feels like that's a little bit confusing for your administrator. That's just my thought.
Some of the question that you had there, it was actually addressed in our last meeting. That a lot of the changes that we're making, a lot of this is going to reflect in the training and implementation phase of this, which happens after recommendation. And Dr. Harden mentioned the school board. As far as may or may not, we have to give our APs some leeway, some help, choices other than just, this is what happened, this is what we're gonna do, this is the end of the story.
Carolyn's had her hand up for a while. Thank you. I'm loud, I don't need that at all. So, I mean, to me, it sounds like what it boils down to is, and Dr. Marshall, I'm sure that as an English teacher, you probably, read for the AP or read for Pearson's ACT essays or whatever. And when you do that, everybody who's reading, everybody who's trying to decide, how are we going to score this, which is kind of like what the administrators need to do. How are we going to code this? Everyone gets together and they, train on what does this look like, what does this look like, what does this look like, so that everyone grades exactly the same across the rubric. And it sounds a little like that's really, instead of saying, do the students understand, well, do the, administrators who have to make all these decisions all the time, do they understand? And then if they can get on the same page, then it doesn't matter what school the kid goes to, it's going to be the same.
I thought I saw someone saying that already.
Okay, so we finished going through. Can we finish the
Well,
data? Are we
people
done?
start
Have we
asking
seen
questions.
enough?
I don't know. So we can move forward.
Are we seen enough? Or well, I don't know what's left. It's a few. Okay.
These are examples in middle. I'm sorry. These are examples in middle school. These are examples in high school.
The weeklies have time.
Yeah.
Jennifer's got stuff. But that's not the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is online, it's the best place to put it.
Ready to move forward? Here's an example in high school. What did we notice from the examples? This was a question asked, and if I'm correct, we were talking about there was some miscoding. Excuse me. There was some miscoding, failure to obey, striking, and attendance. All incidents resulted in suspension, fair or equitable, and these were questions. Is that logical? Developmentally appropriate behavior? Is there anyone on the committee that wishes to talk about this particular slide? So, all incidents resulted in a suspension, fair and equitable, I'll answer it no. The logic, now, if the principal, we understand that Principal Harbo's here, the principal, the AP, the counselor who's ever dealing with that, does have a level of understanding that me sitting in central office does not. So Don Dillard, the student, working with Principal Harbo, the principal Harbo would know more of what Don has done historically in the classroom, in the building, etc. Developmentally appropriate. I know Dr. Dawson was echoing the developmentally appropriate part. I don't know if you have anything to chime in on there at this point. But I think one of the main conversations and facilitators can help is the judgment of variability that has fallen inside of deliberate disruption. Maybe move forward. Best policy practices clearly defining behaviors. So again, we're back to the U.S. Department of Education, not Diversity, Equity, and Poverty, not JCPS, the U.S. Department of Education. Schools that have discipline policies of code of conduct with clear, and this is what Mr. Hughley and some other ones were talking about, clear, consistently applied expectations and consequences will help students improve behavior, increase engagement, etc. So how will clarifying these categories help? So moving forward, the research says that this will help, will reduce well-disciplined schools, balance clearly established and communicated rules of behavior with the climate of concern students as individuals. Fairness of school discipline policies was a factor identified as helping foster academic resilience and school connectedness. Absenteeism and dropout rates are lower in schools where students feel safe and perceive perceived discipline to be fair and effective. This is research. This is research that was presented to the committee. You all remember this discussion and part of that. Is there anybody who wants to comment on any of this part of it? All right, I'll move forward. So describing incidences, they talked about this, teachers entering referrals. This is new. Mr. Bird was talking a lot about that when he was here. Is there anyone that wishes to comment on this teacher entering process right now? Don, do you want to say something?
Like our school started entering our teachers, entering referrals. The one thing that I noticed when they did, I guess sometimes the teachers' viewpoint of they put stuff in the referrals that kind of look a little bit more emotional and can't be defended. So we had to train our teachers to kind of put what's an appropriate referral and what's not an appropriate referral. It cuts down the time. That was a good thing. Other than that, I mean, it gets better data as far as because it's directly cuts the middleman personnel and just goes straight to empty campus where we get that. Other than that, that's.
Anyone else recalling the conversations at their tables around this part of it? I mean, we can move on. I do want to pull out 6% of disruptive behavior suspensions have no description at all. Influence, if I'm correct, that translates into disruptive behavior was put in, but there was no narrative.
Right, it's blank.
Okay. All right. So here were some categorical things that this is Dr. Vanderhaar put under the three levels of infraction, if you will, from restorative, inclusive to exclusionary. And what consequences are disruptive behavior and referral resulting in? So we can look at this, and I'll hold on here for a little while so we can look at this and hopefully get some conversation. You can see, and this is, as you can see, by the levels of schools, 38%, 39%, 28%, 52% restorative. Then we go to inclusive, 1, 4, and 12. And then we go from exclusive, 52, 61 to 35. As resulting in the input, am I saying that right, Florence? As resulting in the input of the qualifying disruptive behavior, this is the results of what happens as far as the consequences.
Right, these are the consequences. I think there's a slide following this that tells you which consequences fall into which of these categories. So exclusion would be the ISAP.
Before that.
Oh yeah, before that, right. So that gives you the breakdown.
So I'm gonna go in here and freeze for a minute. Any, Sheree?
I always have something to say. I'm trying not to say anything. It has nothing to do with the slide. It has to do with this meeting. So I just read a tweet that says, again, this is the same data that we saw before. And it is. And so I think for those of the people that are in the room that weren't on the committee, if you're thinking that the committee is just being quiet because we have nothing to say, we've had this conversation before, and I get why the district is doing this. The data needs to be presented to people outside of the code, but I'm quiet because I know this stuff already. I think the other committee members are too. So this isn't for us. Like we use this data in our recommendations. Everything that I've seen today, I thought about when I made recommendations. It was not something that we just came out of nowhere with. So this is true. This is stuff that we've already seen. This is stuff that we've already discussed. And I know that the district is having this meeting for us to review it, but at the same time, this is, it's very frustrating as a community member, as a mom. I do have kids, JCPS, and an alumni, so I do have a stake, and I don't have a dog in the fight really, but a stake in these, processes, but it is frustrating. And I don't know if the rest of the committee feels frustrated, but I do. So that's all I have to say, and I probably won't say anything else.
Thank you. I personally and professionally appreciate that. Can we move on with this, or do we need more discussion on it? Go ahead, Rashad.
Thanks, John. So, talking about research, and if we're going to share maybe some new research, that's not super new, but I'm reading some research that was developed by Eric Stewart and Ronald Simmons about, and the title of their paper, if anyone's interested, is The Code of the Street and African American Adolescent Violence. And part of what they found, and I think they did a longitudinal study with about 800 or 900 students within urban school districts, and what they found was that 2 factors that contributed to adolescent violent behavior was being connected or attached to their schools, and another one was being exposed to racial discrimination. And so when we look at some of the data that, as Dr. Dawson points out, we're all fairly familiar with, when we look at the data, we're seeing that some of our students are being disconnected at higher rates from our schools. And then some of that, according to some of that we looked at, is rooted in racial disparity. So, I really, my argument then is that if we're going to make our schools safer, we need to really be thoughtful about how we keep kids included. When we look at other large systems like our criminal justice system, we know that large-scale exclusion has not been effective, even though we are far and beyond the highest incarceration rate on the planet. So, as we apply some of those thought processes and models to what we're looking at in terms of how we're keeping kids attached and connected into the schools, it's really important to consider those pieces. The other part, too, what's frustrating for me is that as we look at the data and as we look at where we're really just been missing the ball with code of conduct, and not that folks are intentionally wake up in the morning and say, I really want to miss the ball today. I mean, I think folks are doing the best they can with what they have, right? But there are some policies, some system areas that need some tweaking, right? So when we look at really being bold, and I think what some of the limitations are and some of the frustration might be is we know that this is a category that hasn't been effective, that has not been working. So if we're really going to be bold and ambitious and make the right recommendation, then and if we were going to follow like states, I mean the entire state of California isn't doing this anymore, just completely, right? So how do we get ahead of the ball and get innovative and ambitious so that all of our students have those opportunities to be successful equitably? And to John's point, I mean, if we're looking at, is this fair and equitable? This is a simple point. Is this fair and equitable? And it's hard to argue that it is.
Anybody else? Suspension is not an effective deterrent. This is research. This isn't research that came out of JCPS. This is research that JCPS pulled in. Again, this is Dr. Vanderhaar's, actually some of this is quoted in my dissertation as well. So, I'll read just a couple of these. A large body of research indicates that suspension is an ineffective disciplinary practice to discourage decreasing inappropriate behavior. That's research. Suspension has been found to be a strong predictor of student alienation which is what Rashad was just talking about, from the educational process, academic failure, grade retention, dropout. The committee has seen all of this, and this is, if I'm giving you due injustice for you all, this kind of drove some of the decisions. I'm seeing this part and discussing. All right, I'm handing over to Susan.
So to reiterate the purpose of what drove the discussion and the decisions, examples were provided once again by Dr. Judy Vanderhaar. So when the decision was then, as the committee discussed leveling deliberate disruption, these were examples that were provided by Dr. Vanderhaar. So this was some of the discussion that occurred was determining what those levels look like. So just to kind of give that additional backward information, this is where you were in small groups and had that discussion, and then were able to kind of have that good dialogue in regards to what would determine a level 1 intensity in 2 and 3. So that's when you worked within those small groups. I don't know what happened to that. So nonetheless, but once again, wanted to remind you in regards to what the discussion and what led to the leveling of the deliberate disruptive behavior. So with that being said, that concludes that review portion of the data and what drove the decisions. So then I'm going to turn it over to my 2 fellow facilitators, Kristen and Mindy.
Okay, so as we reflect on the data as well as the feedback we got at the board meeting and some additional conversations that I had, I think there are 3 important things that I'm hoping we can have a serious discussion on. We won't solve all the issues today, but this is what we'll get started on and figure out what we need to do next. So there are 3 questions that I think we're going to address next, and we'll chunk them out, taking a break here shortly. So the first one I think is when we looked back at the Kentucky Department of Education, it was all around clear, concise expectations. So the first question I want the committee to wrestle with is, if we put ourselves in student shoes, looking at the 2 documents that are part of the recommended changes for this year, the levels of interventions and strategies, as well as the charts of behaviors and reactions. If we put ourselves in student shoes, what is not clear about what we are recommending? We'll wrestle with that for a little bit. Next to that, we'll talk about how can we tie the recommended changes that we're making to research or best practices. You know, can we reference what John just covered about suspension not being effective? Can we reference Baltimore? Can we reference Buffalo? Can we reference some other things that justify and tie our recommended changes to research and or best practices? And then the final thing that we need to talk about is next steps. So we've talked a lot about this written document that is a policy, but I think we all can acknowledge that there is a broader conversation here about school climate and culture and quick things that we need to make sure are part of next steps discussions as we go forward on that. Any objections to going through those 3 steps as we spend our time together? Okay, so this is going to be we're just going to get them up here on a list, and then we'll establish a process of going through and discussing each one. So, so starting with the question about putting ourselves in our student shoes, what is unclear? Yes, Adam, did you have something else before I jumped into that?
We have a student right here.
I know, but I didn't want to put it all on his back.
But if he understands it,
yes.
We're going to have a general perception that the rest of the student body would understand.
Yes. A lot of weight on you, sir. We'll stand behind you. So I think that, so any, as you all start to glance at the code of conduct and what we have put together, are the things in there that you feel are not clear if we were in our student shoes having a behavior in the school? And do you all need 5-10 minutes to think through this before I'm expecting a response?
Has the student read, I'm just curious, has he read the proposed code of conduct? I'm just wondering.
Derek, how are you? Have you had a chance?
I just want to know if he's had a chance to actually read the proposed code of conduct before he talks about what might be crystal clear.
No, not at this time.
Some hard thinking and reading going on. Should I have the Jeopardy done for you? Why don't we do this? Let's take as we ponder these 3 questions now that I've laid out the rest of this, let's go ahead and take about a 10-minute break, exchange fluids, whatever you need to do, check your email. All right. We've had a good 12.5-minute break, and Suzanne's going to recap why she has a slide up here first.
So as we come together, I know once again your time is valuable, so if we can kind of reconvene to continue our better half of the morning. The question that she posed was about understanding, and is it clear to the kids? Because when we go back to what the U.S. Department of Ed talks about with Principle 2, it is about those expectations. So students understanding clearly and concisely what those expectations are. So this is important discussion for us to have at this point, because the bottom line is, what good is this going to do if the students do not understand exactly what this document is about? So turn it over to Kristen, and then you all can continue the dialogue and brainstorming.
Thank you, Suzanne. Okay. During your break, who came up with some responses to the first question? Putting ourselves in student shoes, where is the proposed code of conduct not crystal clear? Student, awesome. Here, I'm going to hand you the microphone.
For the inappropriate sexual behavior, and you said, well, the document says that it could be a short-term suspension. But don't you think that it should be a long-term suspension?
because like it's putting other people, like they can see that and then like if they're not used to it, if they won't like know how to react, I think positive, emotional, and mental.
Okay. So you're bringing to discussion whether the range of corrective strategies is appropriate for the inappropriate sexual behavior. Okay, we're going to capture that. Thank you.
All right.
Don't cackle like that.
Yeah, sorry. This conversation about inappropriate sexual behavior lasted a long time in the committee. If everybody remembers correctly, our fear in long-term suspension of that category was basically grounded in elementary school, boy kissing girl, things of that nature. And they were seeing that the suspensions were available for that. That is the reason, I believe, not mistaken with anybody, that we lessened that suspension. We were not putting out there, it is okay to rape a student and nothing will happen to you. That is not okay. And it will end up at level 4.
Yeah, I think it does clarify on there that also accept assault and abuse. So assault and abuse would fall under the
And it is a long-term.
assault, sexual abuse, which does warrant the long-term suspension.
The clarification for sexual assault is not guilty, and that's why we're having confusion.
So is it maybe a positioning thing about where it says inappropriate sexual behavior, we just need to list the next behavior, which is now on the second page, assault, sexual abuse, sexual assault directly under inappropriate sexual behavior? Is that?
That may go further.
Okay.
Blessing communities here.
Okay, so that's one thought. Rashad?
I want to echo that because how we describe errors is critical and can lead to how the narrative then is moved forward. Because if I'm thinking about two elementary kids who are kissing somewhere, that's not sexual behavior, right? I mean, it's not even developmentally appropriate language to describe what's happening between those two youth. And then even on some of those other levels, when you talk about sexual behavior and then you're looking at what's consensual, and then when you're looking at what's non-consensual and how that needs to be dealt with differently as well. But to your point, it's critical. Absolutely. So it's critical that we're real clear with that language so that we're not suggesting other things. I agree. Yes.
I have some. Rashad, are you suggesting we even call, instead of calling it inappropriate sexual behavior? Okay.
I think one of the things that is not clear that I know that I heard at the work session and from a lot of teachers when it comes to most of them, but specifically profanity. It's not clear in here the repetition of what's going on. And I know that, you know, it's left up to the assistant principal or whoever, you know, comes up with the consequence. And then we've already had discussion on will or may not, and that just leads up to subjectivity as well. But we need to put in here like repetition. If they are consistently cussing out the teacher, okay, that might be different than if they just wrote something on a note one time. And I think I've heard that from a lot of teachers. I know Chris Brady, when we was in the work session, said that he doesn't want his child in a room with a student that is just constantly calling their teacher the B word, and no consequences are ever being, you know, never happening. So that's one thing that we really need to make sure that it's understanding clear so that the teachers, the community, that even the students understand. You cannot come in here and just cuss me out every day, and then all the other students are watching. It's just going to be, you know, contagious.
So your point was repetition.
It needs to be addressed in here. They repeatedly are doing
offenses.
So like a modifier of
Totally
some
different.
sort?
It's totally different.
We know what's on the side, like when it goes to level 3, that's a prevention. So we're taking out the rest of it.
But no, but her point is we can't, like, the proposed code of conduct only allows level 1 and 2 for profanity and vulgarity. So I think what you're saying is something along where the first 1 or 2 times that profanity or vulgarity happens, you do X. If it happens 3 or 4 times, you do Y. So looking at the difference when it is, and you use profanity and vulgarity category as an example, but you feel that there are other behaviors on here that have to do with intensity level and how we do it. So Glenn, you were shaking your head no and yes, and you had it up there. Do you want to say something?
No, I was just, the one specific question I had was about gambling at 6. So I didn't know if that was, if we as a committee deliberately left that out, or was that typo?
Gambling on the high school, on the grades 6 to 12 should have level 1 and level 2 dots. That is a typo on the document. I apologize for that. So there should be a dot in level 1 and level 2 under gambling, grades 6 through 12.
Kristen, Principal Harwell had
I just wanted to say that it seems that one thing in talking over the break with some folks, and also to speak to your comment, it's not clear to everyone, it seems especially our community, about how these charts talk to one another and how these levels impact an administrator's decision. Because if you look at the gray boxes where it says 1, 2, 3, and 4, it does allow for repeated or escalating offenses, but that's not immediately clear over here. Progressive discipline is not clear in the data that was up there earlier, as Dr. Beatty pointed out, that a kid could continue, despite multiple interventions and supports that are not effective for whatever reason, the same behavior, and if you continue to do the same response to that, it's just futility. So I think that the notion of progressive discipline is missing from here, or at least not clearly communicated. And that may be part of the issue, but the other issue is really talking through why are these things even on here, why are they at certain levels for elementary school versus high school. There's a lot of research to support the developmental process, and there's also a lot to think about in terms of how it impacts the school culture as a whole. Because we keep the individual in mind, we have to also keep the classroom and the school in mind.
Is there a proposal or something you want us to mark down out of that?
Sorry. I'm sorry, I should have known better. I propose that we talk through these charts very specifically to whomever is interested. Maybe that's, I don't know what forum that is, but as Cherie said, we talked through each of these. We talked about why they're on here, why they're not on here. So to share that with our community, and especially our teachers and parents. And also to make sure that we address progressive discipline more clearly, whether it's in these charts or in the accompanying supplement to the charts, because I think that's missing.
Sure.
I just have a point about the profanity vulgarity, and I'm just wondering if the persistent or repeated profanity or cussing someone out wouldn't be coded under intimidation harassment? Like, if it gets to that extent, would it not be emotional discomfort and verbal abuse? So, I mean, to me, that's another one of those areas where we don't need to increase the level of discipline for profanity and vulgarity, because if it gets to be that point and it's that bad, I think that's intimidation and harassment as defined in the code.
So let me clarify this, and then, yes, John Marshall. So is your discussion as an alternative to progressive discipline, that there already is progressive discipline within there?
No, I was responding to B.
The profanity piece.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. So
It's already.
if somebody curses me out once, it's profanity and vulgarity. If they continue to do it, it shifts over to intimidation and harassment.
Seems like it based on how it's defined in the code.
This is probably a training issue for staff and administrators. If I use a obscene word right now, that's profanity. But if I call you an obscene word, then that's harassment. So I mean, we need to probably teach what the difference is. You know, if I'm sitting here, if I'm sitting here with every other word is I'm saying a profane word, then that probably is covered by the profanity and vulgarity. But if I'm calling you, I'm in your face, I'm calling you the B word and so forth, that's a different category. It falls under the harassment part of it. That's a matter of training.
So, yeah, I was going to ask the question, is this a matter of training, or is there something we need to change in the written document?
I agree with Dan.
Yes. It's a matter of training. That's one point. The committee got to there, okay.
Could we say that what is not covered in the code under the significant deliberate disruption? Is there anything in that category that's not already covered under the code?
Questions for John or the committee? The question, I believe, is there anything in disruptive behavior, deliberate disruption, that is not covered somewhere else in the code of conduct? Of significant deliberate disruption that is not covered somewhere else?
I think that's a real issue, because while I agree with Dr. Marshall and research that this is a very wide category, kids do things you can't plan on. I mean, it's hard to sometimes fit them into a certain category. So what we're going to end up having is the same problem in a different way, I think, because we're going to have behaviors that we can't necessarily plan for or don't necessarily fit, but every reasonable adult would say we can't have that here right now. This isn't the proper place for that. So I think that's why the committee recommended these different levels, because we wanted to at least get more specific on what that was and be able to have conversations with teachers about, well, was this really deliberately disruptive, or was this just not appropriate? And that's where that mild, and moderate came in. But I can think of things. A kid climbing out a window, where would you put that? It's not safe. It's not okay. You gotta have some response to that. What do you do with that? And so someone's going to put that in somewhere, and then we don't have accurate data.
I feel the category that has sexual abuse, sexual assault, those two need to be together. And then regular assault needs to be separated. Also, as we talk about profanity, what about teachers who use profanity? There are a lot of teachers who use profanity. And I taught for about 35 years, so I know that happens, and it still happens. So sometimes things are triggered by things that people do.
So the first part of your proposal was around separating assault from sexual assault.
Right.
And because you think there's some lack of clarity. Okay. Mindy, can we capture that? There's some lack of clarity around the grouping together sexual assault and other types of assault. So separating that. And then I think the teacher issue needs to go in a parking lot somewhere, because that is not, this is the student code of conduct. I agree that it could be a reaction of it.
They need to go to separate, but if they trigger.
Yeah. I agree, just saying that's not part of this conversation that we can impact here, but the student code of conduct. Other thoughts, conversations?
Anyone who's spent any time around an individual under the age of 15 knows that they are unexpected, and you cannot predict what they will do, for sure. If we could build buckets all day, we can control their behavior, no doubt. So absolutely, if a kid engages in a behavior that we can't anticipate, we have to be able to respond to that, no doubt. The question is, should we suspend those kids for those things? Should we suspend children for things that we can't anticipate? I think we could agree that may not be appropriate. So, in particular, should we suspend them with disparity for those things? Is also part of the question. For some of the severe behaviors, I think that you were asking about, I think they certainly fit into other categories without question. But for those minor behaviors that we can't anticipate, minor again, should we suspend them for those things? I don't think we should.
So So was there a proposal in there for a change to this, or you were just stating this vision?
Yes, terminate the category of deliberate disruption immediately is my recommendation.
So I want to be very clear on that. The chief equity officer is not backing off of that, needs to be removed. I want to be very clear, I'm not backing off of that. There is no research that supports it. It's subjective, it's biased, and perpetuates racism.
I agree that disruptive behavior, we need to really focus on it. But if we do not, and this is not really for this Code of Conduct Committee, but if we don't have proactive strategies put in place prior to eliminating all this, then it's not going to be effective, I don't think. So, and I know that's not for this committee because we're looking at the consequences, but we cannot eliminate those consequences because I feel like it's going to end up being turmoil. You're just going to have so much. We have to have those proactive strategies in place. We've got to recognize that some of these kids are coming in with with post-traumatic stress syndrome, and that we are not monitoring them well enough. We don't have a system in place to tell you what kids are in this area where this shooting just happened. So those things need to be addressed. Those things need to be monitored. And then we can, come up with, okay, so we shouldn't suspend, because all of these behaviors come from of what's been going on with this child outside of school. And there's privacy acts to where we can't even, I don't even know what's going on with my kids. No one's gonna tell me what's going on with my kids. So I cannot help with these proactive strategies if I don't know what's going on.
That kind of goes into our third bucket over there. If you wanna, some of it is in there, but I think implementing it on the next steps, and help me if I capture this right, is implementing or assuring or training on proactive steps to prevent the disruptive behavior.
All of it.
Anything, everything. So that's the beginning of that needs to
Dealing
be.
with trauma.
Yes.
Dealing with trauma. Let's just put it out there. These kids are traumatic. They're not, we were not raised like these kids. Things that they go through, we don't have to, and I'm not trained to specifically know how to treat this child and say the right things. I might say the wrong thing to trigger, just like she said. I'm a teacher, yes, and I might trigger that child. And so it was really my fault, but I didn't even know what happened to that child that night. So, those are the things that are on the table that we're not addressing right now that needs to be addressed, but this is the code of conduct. We can only talk about the consequences.
And I would like to piggyback on that also. I have to agree with Dr. Marshall. We need to learn to change the behavior of students. We can do this and change the code of conduct, but I have to agree with the teacher as well. We have students that have PTSD, and I represent bus drivers. I'm a manager. So bus drivers have hit me pretty hard this last few weeks because I have to agree suspension is not the answer. We have to change the behavior of the students to change the behavior of their actions. They don't know what is wrong or right because of what they endure. I also have to agree with you. We have more African American students that are suspended more than we have white American students. Let's just be honest. The district is not equal. Society is not equal. Until we have equality in our district, we will always have separation. Separation is not equal. So we can sit here and change the code of conduct, but until we teach the mindset of our students, we will always fail our children of today's society. So our next step for me is not only training, but changing the behavior of the student. We can't always change their environment, but we can sympathize and empathize for where they come from. And they should be treated equal and not being put aside because of where they came from.
What I'm hearing from this.
Would that be changing culture then? Is that a better way to describe it? Would that be fair?
So what I think I'm hearing from you two here as you talk is it almost needs to happen in concert of changing the corrective strategies that we're proposing along with an increase in support systems for students. And there almost needs to be like a 3 or 4 year plan around how we do this. It's just, okay, so we are gonna spend 5 more minutes talking about this bucket 1, and then we're gonna shift to this about tying this to research and best practices. So I know you had your hand up, and Tara Lynn.
I'll deal with my next steps.
Okay.
This is great timing with the Festival of Faiths conference going on this week in Louisville, as well as Mayor Fisher's Compassionate Louisville situation. But if the Dalai Lama said compassion is nonviolence, then let's try to implement more compassionate schools into our school district, and not just 2 or 3 at a time, since we have a few 100 or so plus. And
So that's the next step.
yeah, that's the next step. And then also pigeonholing certain kids, because sometimes they could wake up with an abscessed tooth and maybe not be able to articulate, but let's just have that compassion for them to say, okay, we're trying to build your trust, and you can trust us. If you're in a PTSD situation, along with your parent who's going through PTSD, then let's try to find more supports. I think there was also a conversation about supporting more counselors or hiring more counselors or something, because there's only 16, I think.
You mean mental health counselors?
Or something like that, yeah.
Mental health counselors, right? Counselor for every school, mental, I just want to make sure.
Hi, so I'm just wondering, did the committee consider a further breakdown in the, not in the levels, but in the distinctions between PK through 5 and 6 through 12? Because we know developmentally a lot is happening in those middle years, and the data from last year shows that over 70% of the incidents that result in suspensions or removals, even in school removals, happen actually in grades 7 through 10. So I'm just wondering if you guys had looked if you looked at or considered the possibility of even a 3rd or 4th. I know that's a lot, but just another distinction in terms of the categories. And then one additional question might be later is what role does evaluating individual child needs come into play in the levels and the escalation of impact on them?
So I wanted to jump back and recap you. So you had some great next steps, and then I also think, yes, if you ask any of the committee members, and y'all jump in if I'm, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, everybody wants to be student-centered and how to deal with that. But we've got to write a policy that helps us support how we're doing that. And that is what we're trying to deal with here. And then committee, again, jump in if I do this correctly, but we had not discussed a specific thing around additional groupings of them. So I think we could put that up there as putting ourselves in the student's shoe as a possibility that we could discuss grouping the middle grades together. Are you capturing that? Mindy? Okay. So we're gonna, this is gonna be the last comment on this topic, and we're gonna shift to the second bucket here.
We need to make sure that we have counselors who have an opportunity to counsel. And something we experimented with at our school is that the first hour and a half of every day, counselors were free to deal with children who said they had problems. So, you know, when a kid comes in and there is something bothering them, they went to the counselor. And I think that, you know, we could end up not having a lot of classroom problems if the kids were allowed to go. And sometimes there would be large groups of them, sometimes small groups. So, you know, we need interventions. And one of the interventions would be that children who come in having some type of trauma, that they go to the counselor.
So I want to capture that in the next steps.
I think I have it here.
Interventions, but that was a specific, it was a specific idea that I just want to make sure we have recorded about the counselors or availability of adults to deal with kids upon arrival of issues that they brought to the table. So I think that's a specific idea that may be a best practice as we look at other schools and see how that would be effective to implement in some of our schools. Okay, I said that was the last comment, but I'll let you know. We have time for one more. And then this will be the last one.
Okay, at the beginning you all stated that the students, that's going to state that the student may or may not be suspended depending on the AP or the administration in the building. Now, is the student going to understand that? You know, if I do this, I may or may not get suspended for fighting. You know, I think it needs to be clear, and I don't think it needs to be a gray area. It needs to be black or white.
I'll let Ms. Lord, directly with students to address that. So this is regarding the shift in the previous code of conduct where it went from will suspend to may suspend, and there was a certain philosophy around that.
That was
Kim, that was the previous thing. Kim, are you willing to speak on that?
I can't.
About
I can only speak for my school, but that has not had an impact really on us whatsoever because we only suspend for certain things that our kids are very aware of. It's the zero tolerance issues and fighting. At Seneca, everything else, we work hard with our kids to keep them in school and in class. So I can't really speak too much except that I think that allowed in the past where schools might have leaned on that and immediately suspended instead of thinking about what else can we do would probably assist that process.
As an assistant principal, it does give us the leeway to make that decision there. We got into, is it pushing, is it shoving? So that gives us the option to say, no, that's all it is. We'll just put you in the ISAC, and it's not a suspendable offense. So when it is truly considered as fighting, we do go with the zero tolerance as a suspendable.
okay, we are gonna, so before I move on though, that seemed to be like a proposal on this first bucket of discussing that, going back to discussing that will versus may suspend. Is that something you want to kind of put up there as an idea to discuss? So if you'll just capture discussion of, well, no, right there, discussion of will versus may. Yes. Okay, so we're going to jump to the second bucket here around can we tie our recommended changes to research and best practices? And I'm beginning to wonder, co-facilitators, if this might be a good small group project and then bring it back together versus trying to do it as a large group. Okay, so I think what we'd like to do, and we can, well, is do some small groups discussing about tying the work to changes, and then we'll spend about 15 minutes in small groups, and then we'll pull it back together and be able to share it. So we're not expecting you all to draw a straight line, you know, this change was made because of this research, but some general consensuses around the changes that we're making and how those were arrived at using the data or the best practices that we had seen. So I think maybe these two tables could be a group here, and then these two tables here, and then Stan and your line, just one group right there. Did I miss any actual committee members in that group?
Yeah. So once again, just to reiterate, it goes back to that why piece and kind of go back to those discussions that you had as you were creating and thinking through those changes.
Kim, if you want to join that group back there. So 10 minutes in small groups to talk about tying changes to best practices, 15 minutes, and then we'll pull it back together, share, shift to next steps, and the timeline gets us out of here at 11:30.
Are those clear expectations?
There's a group of 4 back there.
We need, as facilitators, to clarify. Good?